In the previous lecture, we discussed Markov models. In this lecture, we're going to discuss a variation of this technique called hidden Markov models. To motivate this problem, we've seen how, in the previous lecture, how Markov models are models for sequential data, where we assumed that we could observe the sequence of states. Either we could observe them, or we could build a model in which we are able to observe them. So in the two cases that we looked at, ranking and semi-supervised classification, we actually are never given a sequence of states. But the models that we construct assume that we can generate that sequence of states, and it's going to give us something we care about. So we work at the state level, where the sequences are only of states and nothing else. However, in many cases, the model might not be flexible or expressive enough to work on a discrete state level. So again, remember that the states, as we constructed them previously, were discrete. They were finite and discrete. There were a finite and discrete number of states. But the data we get might not really work in that setting. So we might want to instead let each state in our model correspond to a probability distribution on the observable part of the sequence. So this leads to the idea of a hidden Markov model. Hidden being because we don't get to observe a latent states sequence. So as just mentioned, the hidden Markov model is different from a Markov model or a Markov chain in that it treats the sequence of states differently. So here we're going to assume that our sequence of states is a latent variable in our model, and that the observed variable that we get to see, which is part of our data, depends on the state, but it's not one-to-one mapping to the state. So it's a variation of the state. So here's a graphical model representation of the two before we get into more detailed explanation. So with the Markov model, the way we constructed the generative process was we assumed that we were transitioning from state to state. So here's a sequence of 4 different states. So our data sequence would be 4-dimensional, and each of these nodes would be a number between 1 to s if we have s different states, and the value of the state at time 2 depends on the value of the state at time 1 based on the Markov transition matrix. Now we're going to end up with something that looks like this, where the state sequence that we have here is exactly the same as what we described in the last lecture, only it's not colored in because it's not observed. So here we color it in because we assume that we're observing these state sequences. In the hidden Markov model, we have the same exact generative process for generating these state sequences, but we don't get to observe it. Instead, what we get to observe is a conditional probability distribution, or a random variable generated from a conditional probability distribution picked out by the state. So given that I'm in a certain state at time 2, I then generate an observed random variable x2 that is conditionally dependent on whatever state I'm in here at this time. So let's look at an example where we transition from a Markov chain to a hidden Markov model. So let's imagine in this toy example in the next couple slides that we have 3 possible states in R2. So here's the second state, the third state, and the first state. We're giving it a physical representation in R2, so we're going to say that the third state has this point in R2, so it's a 2-dimensional vector that represents the third state, a 2-dimensional vector that represents the first state, and a 2-dimensional vector that represents the second state. And so now, since we have only 3 unique positions that we could transition between, we simply index them. We don't give the 2-dimensional vector corresponding to the first state. We give the index of the first state 1. And so when we generate a Markov sequence, so we have, for example, the Markov transition matrix A. So in this lecture, we're going to switch to the standard notation A for a hidden Markov model. So if we assume that we have a 3x3 Markov transition matrix A, then the ijth value is the probability of transitioning from state I to state j. So for example, A21 is the probability of going from the second state to the first state. And A12 is the probability of going from the first state to the second state. So here's how we can physically represent the transition. And A11 is the probability of transitioning from state 1 to itself, etc. So last time, we didn't need to think about these embeddings of these states in some space. We simply generated a sequence using the state index. So we would get a sequence 1, 2, 1, 3, 2, and that would indicate that our transition was from this point to this point to this point to this point to this point, something like that. Okay, but now in the case of a hidden Markov model, it's useful to think of each state as being embedded in some location, some latent space. Because now let's imagine that we have the same exact three states. So the center of these three ellipses corresponds exactly to the location of these three states. The color is exactly the same. But now each time we arrive at one of the three states, we don't get to observe the exact location of the state. It's not a deterministic, discrete thing we get to see. We get to see the location of the state with some random permutation. So instead of seeing these three vectors over and over again and only these three two-dimensional vectors, we get to see that vector plus some noise. So again, we have the same sequence of states according to a Markov transition matrix A, where we have the same transitions, for example, 1, 2, 1, 3, 2, which would be 1, 2, 1, 3, 2. Same positions in R2. However, if we now let mu1 be the position of state 1, so mu1 corresponds to this point here. This is mu1, this point here. Then what we get to observe is not mu1, which would be the case of a Markov chain. What we get to observe at time I, if we're in state 1 at time I, is mu1 plus some noise, epsilon I. So we get to observe xi, which is mu1 plus some noise. And the noise, for example, could have this contour. And for example, we could assume that that noise is Gaussian, in which case we get to observe a Gaussian random variable with this distribution. And so now we don't get to observe the sequence of means, mu1, mu2, or mu3. We get to observe a sequence x1 to xt, where each of these vectors, xi, is a randomly permuted mean vector. So here's again the sequence we're thinking about. So this describes what's called a continuous hidden Markov model. We assume we have some Markov chain like this, for example, 3 states, except we don't get to observe the 3 states exactly. We get to observe some random permutation of those states. And so a sequence of data might look like this, where this is x1, this is x2, and we have all of these transitions. For example, we have this point at xi, and then at xi plus 1, we move from this point to this point. So we now have a data set, in this case, of 2-dimensional vectors, and we have that set ordered. So previously, for example, with the Gaussian mixture model, which also kind of looked like this, we didn't care about the ordering of the data. We never said there was something significant about the fact that xi was what it was and that xi plus 1 was what it was. Now, the ordering of the data is going to matter, because we're going to assume that there's some first-order hidden Markov model underlying that generation. So again, on the left, we have Markov transition matrix. In the middle, we've taken this Markov chain and we've now defined a state-dependent probability distribution on the observed data. And on the right, we now have a sequence of observations where, for example, in all of these points we're in this second state, and all of the blue points we're in the third state, and all of the red points are in the red state, meaning that every blue point is a random variable with this distribution. The red and the green points are also random variables with their corresponding distributions. And the order in which we generated these points was like this. So we started in this state, moved to this state, and stayed here for a while. Finally, we moved to the red state and stayed there for a while, and then we made it back to the green state. All right, now let's look at a formal definition of a hidden Markov model. A hidden Markov model consists of three things. If we assume it's an S-state hidden Markov model, so we have S different states, we have an S by S transition matrix A, which gives the probability of transitioning from any state to any other state. We assume an initial state distribution, so this pi is an S-dimensional probability vector that gives a distribution on the first state. Since we have to start somewhere, we can't start by making a transition. We have to have a distribution on where we start. So that's encoded by pi. And then finally, we have a state-dependent emission distribution. So that's the probability distribution on the observed data at time I, given that I'm in state k at time I. So that's this distribution. So some density p of x I given a parameter indexed by the state at time s that I'm in at time I. So these are the three different parts of the HMM. And now if I want to generate data, I have to define a generative process because this is a probability model. So I want to generate a sequence x1, x2, x3, and so on. And I do so as follows. First, I sample the first state from a discrete distribution using pi as the distribution on the first state. So I get a first state. It's an index between 1 and s. That state then picks out a parameter associated with a distribution for that state. And I generate my observation x1 from that distribution using the parameter indexed by the state that I'm in at time 1. And then I follow that by generating the rest of the sequence through a Markov chain. So I simply generate a sequence of states where at time I, the distribution on my state at time I, given that I'm in state k prime at time I minus 1, is simply a discrete distribution where I pick out a probability distribution on states from the kth row, k primeth row of my transition matrix. So this matrix, again, has S different transition distributions to the S states, depending on which state I'm at. And I pick out the state that I'm at time I minus 1 by picking out my transition distribution to all of the states, given where I'm at, to generate my state at time I. Following that, when I generate the state for the ith observation, I actually generate the data. I generate the ith observation itself from a probability distribution where I pick out the parameter associated with the state that I'm in at time I. And so we've left this general. There are two different distributions, of course, we could have on the data. We could have continuous distributions or discrete distributions, depending on whether the data, the sequence of data that we have, x1 to xt, depending on whether we want to model each of these observed data points as a continuous random variable or a discrete random variable. When we want to model these as continuous, then the distribution on the data is a continuous distribution, often a Gaussian. And in that case, we say we're doing a continuous HMM. When we model the data as discrete, then the parameter for the state S is simply a vector of probabilities on the discrete set of observed values that X can take. In that case, we say we're doing a discrete HMM. So HMMs are always discrete in the states. There are always a set of S different states that we can visit. So each HMM is discrete in that sense. But when we modeled the observed data as either a continuous or discrete random variable. That then differentiates whether we're doing a continuous HMM or discrete HMM. In the rest of this lecture, I want to focus on the simpler case, which is the discrete HMM. And so now I'm going to define this probability distribution more precisely and say that we have a matrix B, where B has S rows and it has V columns. If x1 can be a number between 1 to V, so it can take one of V different discrete values, then the Sth row, the row S of my matrix B, says the probability of my observation for a data point that comes from that state. So I'm indexing now my distribution on the data for each state along the rows of B.